There's a particular kind of exhaustion that settles in when you need God most, but find yourself unable to form even the simplest prayer. Maybe you're sitting in your car after a difficult day, knowing you should pray, but the weight of everything has stolen your words. Perhaps you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, your mind racing with worries. Yet when you try to speak to God, you feel like you're grasping at air. Or maybe you've experienced loss so profound that the very idea of constructing sentences feels impossible, like trying to build with hands that won't stop shaking. The most transformative shift you can make in your prayer life is to stop performing and start conversing. Most of us learn to pray like we were addressing a distant king through formal protocol, carefully choosing elevated language and avoiding anything too mundane or personal. But God isn't a cosmic bureaucrat who needs proper paperwork. He's a father who delights in the everyday details of your life, who wants to hear about your morning coffee and your afternoon frustrations with equal attention. Imagine God sitting across from you right now, not on a throne surrounded by intimidating glory, but in the chair next to yours, leaning forward with genuine interest. He's not checking his watch. He's not comparing your prayers to someone else's. He's not taking notes on your theological accuracy. He's simply present, the way the best listeners in your life have been present, except infinitely more patient and understanding. This is how conversational prayer works. You talk to God the same way you talk to someone who knows you completely and loves you unconditionally. You can tell him about the way the sunlight hit your kitchen window this morning and how it reminded you of your grandmother's house. You can mention that you're worried about that conversation you need to have with your boss, or that you're excited about something small that probably wouldn't matter to anyone else. You can admit that you ate too much yesterday and felt sluggish, or that you heard a song that made you think of him. The beauty of conversational prayer is that it removes the artificial barrier between spiritual topics and regular life. Everything becomes fair game because everything in your life matters to God. When you share everyday details with him, you're not wasting his time. You're acknowledging his presence in the ordinary moments that make up most of your existence. This isn't trivial, it's deeply theological. It recognizes that God isn't just the God of your crisis moments and your church services. He's the God of your Tuesday afternoon and your grocery runs. You might pray something like, "Lord, I had that tea you know I love today, and it reminded me of my mother. I miss her wisdom, especially right now when I'm trying to figure out this situation at work. She would have known what to say." Notice how this prayer weaves together the physical detail of the tea, the emotional memory of your mother, and the current challenge you're facing. This isn't scattered thinking. It's how real relationships work. We connect dots. We associate memories with present moments. We let one thought lead to another. Or you might say, "Father, I feel small and overlooked today. I know I shouldn't compare myself to others, but I did it anyway when I saw that social media post. I feel like I'm always behind, always catching up to where I think I should be." This kind of honesty, admitting to feelings you know aren't entirely rational, is exactly what God invites. He already knows about your comparison struggles and your insecurities. Pretending they don't exist doesn't protect your relationship with him, it stunts it. Sometimes conversational prayer means sharing dreams that feel too big or too personal to voice anywhere else. "God, I have this hope that I'm almost afraid to say out loud, even to my closest friends. I dream of things that seem impossible from where I'm sitting, but I'll tell you because I believe you planted some of these desires in my heart." This approach finds its biblical foundation in Psalm 62, verse 8, where David writes, "Trust in him at all times, ye people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us."
The phrase "pour out your heart" suggests something unfiltered, uncensored, complete. You don't carefully measure what you pour out, you empty the container. David modeled this kind of prayer throughout the Psalms, often including details that might seem unnecessary or emotions that weren't particularly noble. He complained about his enemies, celebrated his victories, confessed his fears, and questioned God's timing, yet always returned to trust. When you pray conversationally, you're following David's example of bringing your whole self, messy thoughts, random observations, complicated emotions, into God's presence. You're treating prayer less like a religious duty and more like the ongoing conversation with God that it's meant to be. There's a profound moment in every believer's journey when they discover that God doesn't need their composure. We've been conditioned to believe that prayer requires a certain emotional stability, that we should pull ourselves together before approaching the throne of grace. But this assumption misses one of the most beautiful truths about God's character. He doesn't just tolerate our tears, He treasures them. In Psalm 56, verse 8, David reveals something stunning about God's attentiveness to our sorrow. "Put thou my tears into thy bottle. Are they not in thy book?" This isn't poetic exaggeration, it's theological reality. God doesn't view your tears as emotional excess or spiritual weakness. He collects them like precious things, recording each one as significant. The God who counts the hairs on your head also counts the tears on your cheeks, and neither escapes His notice or concern. When your words fail completely, when the weight of your circumstances has crushed your ability to articulate anything coherent, your tears become a language all their own. They speak of loss that can't be quantified, of hope that feels fragile, of love that runs deeper than explanation. Tears communicate what words often cannot, the full depth of human experience in its rawest form. And God, who created you with tear ducts and emotional capacity, receives this communication as authentic prayer.
Consider the times when you've sat in your car and wept over a relationship that's falling apart, unable to form any requests beyond "help me." Those tears weren't the prelude to prayer, they were the prayer. They expressed everything your heart needed to say: the fear, the grief, the desperate need for God's intervention, the acknowledgement of your powerlessness to fix what's broken. In that moment of complete emotional honesty, you were praying with your whole being. Or think about the nights you've cried over a child who's made choices that break your heart, when you've run out of words to beg for their safety and their return to faith. Your tears carried prayers too complex for language, intercession mixed with regret, hope tangled with heartbreak, surrender woven through with fierce parental love. God heard every unspoken petition in those tears because He understands the language of a parent's heart. There's something uniquely powerful about tears that come in God's presence because they represent the kind of prayer that bypasses all our defense mechanisms. When we cry before God, we're not trying to manage His impression of us or maintain any pretense of having it all together. We're simply present in our pain. And that presence, raw, unguarded, completely vulnerable, is exactly what intimacy with God looks like. The tears you shed over dreams that died, relationships that ended, diagnoses that changed everything, children who struggle, parents who are aging, finances that seem impossible. These aren't signs that your faith is insufficient. They're evidence that your heart is still alive, still hoping, still invested in outcomes that matter.
God doesn't want you to pray through gritted teeth, forcing optimism you don't feel. He wants you to bring your actual emotional state into His presence, trusting that He can handle whatever you're really experiencing. Sometimes the most honest prayer you can offer is showing up in God's presence and letting yourself feel the full weight of your circumstances without trying to fix them or explain them away. When you sit quietly and let the tears come, you're acknowledging that some things are too big for you to carry alone, too complex for you to solve, too painful for you to process without help. This isn't resignation. It's recognition of your need for a God who is bigger than your ability to cope. Your tears also represent a form of trust, even when trust feels impossible. Every tear shed in God's presence says, "I'm bringing this pain to you because I believe you see me. You care about what matters to me, and you're capable of comfort I cannot provide for myself." Even when you can't feel God's nearness, even when His silence seems overwhelming, the act of crying before Him declares your faith that He is present and engaged with your suffering. God doesn't rush to stop your tears or hurry you past your grief. He doesn't hand you spiritual platitudes or remind you that others have it worse. He sits with you in your sorrow the way the most compassionate friend would, understanding that some pain needs to be fully felt before it can begin to heal. Your tears don't make Him uncomfortable or impatient. They move His heart with the same tenderness He felt when He wept over Jerusalem, when He stood at Lazarus' tomb and wept despite knowing He would raise him from the dead. The most dangerous prayer habit you can develop is the practice of emotional editing, carefully curating what parts of your inner life you'll admit to God. We've somehow convinced ourselves that God prefers our cleaned-up version, that He's more comfortable with our sanitized thoughts and socially acceptable struggles. But this approach doesn't protect God from our messiness. It protects us from the vulnerability that real relationship requires. God already knows about your jealousy. He's already aware of your anger, your doubts, your petty resentments, and your secret fears. Hiding these things from Him doesn't preserve His good opinion of you. It prevents you from experiencing His grace in the areas where you most desperately need it. When you pretend that certain thoughts and feelings don't exist in your prayers, you're essentially asking God to love a fictional version of yourself while leaving your actual self outside His care. Consider the jealousy that rises up when you see others succeed in areas where you feel stuck. Most of us would never admit in prayer, "God, I'm jealous of her promotion, and part of me hopes she fails because it makes me feel better about where I am." We think this confession would shock God or diminish His love for us. But God isn't surprised by your jealousy. He created you as a human being with a fallen nature, and He knows exactly how comparison wounds manifest in your heart. When you bring this jealousy into prayer honestly, you're not informing God of something He didn't know. You're positioning yourself to receive His help in an area where you're currently trying to manage alone. The same is true for anger that feels unchristian. Maybe you're furious with God over unanswered prayers, frustrated with Him for allowing suffering you can't understand or accept. Religious culture often teaches us to suppress this anger, to spiritualize it away, to feel guilty for experiencing it. But biblical characters regularly brought their anger into dialogue with God. Job didn't politely request an explanation for his suffering, he demanded one, accusing God of injustice and calling Him to account. Jeremiah complained bitterly about the cost of prophetic ministry, essentially telling God that following Him had made his life miserable. Habakkuk questioned God's apparent inaction in the face of evil, refusing to accept easy answers. None of these men were punished for their honest anger. Instead, they were met with God's response, sometimes explanation, sometimes deeper revelation of His character, sometimes simply the assurance that He could handle their full emotional range without being threatened or wounded by it. When you bring your anger to God directly, you're treating Him like someone strong enough to absorb your full emotional range without being threatened or wounded by it. Your doubts deserve the same honest treatment. The questions that keep you awake at night, about God's goodness, about whether He really hears your prayers, about whether your faith is built on anything solid, these aren't spiritual failures. They're human responses to living in a world where faith requires trust beyond sight. When you pray, "God, I'm not even sure you're there, and I'm terrified that I've built my life on something that isn't real," you're not exhibiting weak faith. You're exhibiting courage to bring your most vulnerable fears into the light where they can be addressed rather than allowing them to fester in the darkness of unspoken anxiety.
The writer of Hebrews understood this dynamic when he wrote in chapter 4, verse 16, "Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." The word boldly here doesn't mean arrogantly or presumptuously. It means with confidence, without reservation, holding nothing back. It means approaching God with the assurance that He can handle whatever you're really dealing with, that He's not fragile enough to be damaged by your honest struggle. This boldness extends to confessing the things you're most ashamed of, the thoughts that make you question your own character, the behaviors you can't seem to change, the motives you wish were purer. When you admit to God, "I helped that person, but if I'm honest, it was partly because I wanted others to see me being generous," you're not revealing anything that surprises Him. You're acknowledging what He already knows, while positioning yourself to receive grace for mixed motives, rather than trying to maintain the exhausting pretense of pure ones. Prayer becomes infinitely more powerful when it becomes the place where you stop performing and start revealing. God doesn't need you to be impressive in prayer. He needs you to be present. He's not looking for evidence that you've got your spiritual life figured out. He's offering to help you navigate the parts that still feel impossible. The uncomfortable things you're afraid to mention are often exactly the areas where God most wants to meet you with His transforming grace.